Ina mana, ina reo, ina iwi, ina raurangatirama, tēnā koutou katoa. I'm pleased to speak at the opening of this panel discussion on progress made on the Christchurch Call to Action. First, I do want to commend France for its commitment to hosting the Paris Peace Forum despite the challenges posed by the COVID-19 pandemic. And I do wish to extend the thoughts and sympathies of New Zealanders to the people of France, who have seen horrific terrorist attacks in recent weeks. New Zealand stands resolute and united alongside France in opposing terrorist attacks, and we will continue to do so alongside all those who oppose extreme terror events. Now more than ever, unity and collective action are needed to address global problems that are beyond the reach of governments working alone, be it virtually or in person. We have come together because we all understand that we must continue striving for peace. COVID-19 has closed many international borders and is also a threat to peace. That's because the pandemic is exacerbating some of the world's worst trends, be they economic or societal. This in turn can feed violent, extremist and terrorist ideologies. We also know that regardless of whether physical borders are open or shut, terrorism and violent extremism and associated abhorrent content online transcends borders. But so too does our commitment to unity, tolerance, inclusiveness and peace. The atrocities of the Christchurch terrorist attack nearly 18 months ago were horrifically magnified by the perpetrator, live streaming the attack. In response, New Zealand and France launched the Christchurch Call to Action. The call brings governments and the tech industry together in a commitment to eliminate terrorist and violent extremist content online, working with civil society. Now, we've made significant progress through last month's attacks, and France remind us of the urgency in continuing to implement the commitments we undertook last May. Today, we report collective progress against the commitments of the call. We also outline where further work is needed. I'm proud of the tangible progress we've made over the first year. The reformed Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism, or the GIFCT, is now an independent organisation with dedicated resources and a 24/7 crisis management function at its disposal. The early indicators suggest the GIFCT is on the right path. The GIFCT is guided by an independent advisory committee made up of concerned governments and civil society, and is supported by a multi-stakeholder forum to incorporate views of the wider community. The GIFCT is a focused work program to tackle the key challenges that we face. These include understanding the effects of content sharing algorithms, which is particularly important, the need for better transparency reporting, and further improving our crisis response. Now, this work has only just begun. Thanks to the Christchurch Call, we have the shared means, though, to work collaboratively to stop an attack being broadcast and spread online. We have a shared crisis response protocol to facilitate communication between industry and governments during an incident. Complementing this, GIFCT companies have their own crisis incident protocol. So too do European Union member states, Europol and European online service providers. Now, none of these protocols existed at the time of the Christchurch attack. Sadly, all except the shared crisis response protocol have needed to be activated several times since. This work has already improved rapid coordination and action to reduce the chances of something on that scale that happened to us happening again. It is of some comfort, and yet we have not seen another online event on the scale of the Christchurch attack. But the recent instances of terrorists and violent extremists co-opting the internet, including most recently in Paris, tell me that there is more work required. As a result of the Christchurch Call, governments and major tech companies now have the structures in place to deliver a coordinated response to terrorist and violent extremist incidents. I want now to see us directing our focus to faster, open and more transparent communication during a crisis. I also want to see a step change in the way companies identify and address different types of terrorist and violent content, recognising the harm it causes, no matter the medium. Whether this material is directly on platforms or made accessible through search engines, its impact is the same, whether it be via live stream, video, written material, or photographic images. Its intent is still to terrorise and amplify the harm of a real-world attack. Terrorist and violent extremist content has no place on the internet. Our goal is singular: to eliminate terrorist and violent extremist content online. Symbolic of the continued momentum behind the Christchurch Call, support for the initiative continues to grow. The call is now supported by over 50 countries and international organisations and 10 tech companies. New Zealand and France, along with other supporters, share a priority in the coming year to bring on board more tech company supporters. Engagement by industry is critical to continued progress. The work of the Christchurch Call is informed by an advisory network of international civil society representatives to provide guidance to governments and industry. This includes non-governmental organisations, academia and others who focus on counter-radicalisation, public policy and human rights. The initial findings from the inaugural Christchurch Call community consultation exercise being released later today represent our joint commitment to share best practices. It is important all call supporters deliver on their commitments while protecting a free, open and secure internet and respecting human rights and fundamental freedoms. We have a common goal, and that gives us a clear direction. While many different governments, tech companies and civil society organisations work together, we do not always agree on everything. But our common goal, along with the voluntary principled approach in the Christchurch Call, acknowledges all supporters have a role to play, and that there may be differing paths to reach our endpoint. I'd like to close with a whakatauki, a proverb from New Zealand. Whae te iti kahurangi ki te tohu, ko me he maunga titi. Pursue that which is precious, and if you bow your head, let it only be to the loftiest mountain. The end point, a safer internet without terrorist and violent extremist content online, is a precious goal. It remains unchanged. We haven't achieved it unless we all get there. And if we work together, we will. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak to you all today. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa.
Kia ora, tātou katoa. Ngā mihi nui ki a koutou. Bonjour à tous et à toutes. Today for this session on this church call, Defining the Next Steps Collectively. That was New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern. I am Paul Ash, the Prime Minister's Special Representative on Cyber and Digital, and I'm delighted to be joined today by a panel of colleagues who have worked closely with me and others throughout the Christchurch Call process. We have here today Courtney Gregoire, the Chief Digital Safety Officer from Microsoft and Chair of the Global Internet Forum to Counter-Terrorism's Operating Board. We have Anjum Rahman, who is co-chair of the Christchurch Call Advisory Network and from the New Zealand Islamic Women's Council. And we have Henri Verdier, Ambassadeur pour le Numérique, Digital Ambassador of France. And I'm delighted to be able to share the stage with this group and to be able to talk through some of the issues around the Christchurch Call. Coming right, we have Henri Verdier presenting the results of the Christchurch Call community consultation. And then a panel discussion exploring some questions around the Christchurch Call before we have 10 minutes of question and answer at the end of the session. Henri, could I please hand the stage to you to talk through the outcomes of our community consultation, please?
Yes. Good morning, everyone, and good morning. Hello, Paul. So I'm Henri Verdier, Ambassador for Digital Affairs. First, many thanks to Prime Minister Ardern for her remarks. I just want to share that France has been honored to work alongside New Zealand on trying to prevent the internet from being exploited by terrorist and violent extremist content. And we are determined to continue our work in a way that is fully consistent with the principles of a free and open internet. Before starting this presentation, I would like us to remember that today is the 5th anniversary of the Bataclan attack. 5 years ago in Paris, 131 innocents lost their lives and 413 others were wounded in the Bataclan attack. I would also like to take a moment to remember the victims of the two recent horrific terrorist attacks that occurred in France, in Conflans-Sainte-Honorine and Nice, as well as in Austria a couple of days ago. All these attacks were horrific assaults on our fundamental freedoms and democratic values and killed and wounded a lot of people. And as you know, the barbaric nature of these attacks was aggravated by the dissemination on the internet of related terrorist content. We see this more and more frequently. The spread of content is a part of the terrorist attack design. And fighting the dissemination is not just protecting the victims, it's also fighting the terrorists. And that's why what we are doing is so important. Of course, the virality of the last French attack cannot compare to those of the Christchurch attacks, and it's partly thanks to the crisis protocol put in place through the Christchurch Call. Yet, they still did spread across the internet, and this underlined once again the harms that can be caused by terrorist and violent extremist content online, a threat still very much present. This confirms that much more needs to be done, and that the work together, government, tech companies, and civil society must continue. And in this spirit of continued multi-stakeholder engagement, that France and New Zealand, as co-founders of the call, organized. In this spirit of continued multi-stakeholder engagement, France and New Zealand organized an online consultation open to all governments and online service providers supporting the call, as well as to members of the Christchurch Call advisory network. The aim of the consultation was to better understand how the Christchurch Call's stakeholders are implementing the call's principles and what next steps should be taken to fulfill the voluntary commitments. The consultation was designed with the help of members of the Christchurch Call advisory network and was open for 4 weeks. In that time, and still we had the difficult circumstances caused by COVID-19. We received a total of 38 different contributions to the consultation. 6 of the 7 companies that have supported the call since September 2019. Of the call supporting government and international organizations, 23, and important numbers of civil society organization members of the Christchurch Call advisory network, 9 members. So first, we can thank you for your involvement, and this effort to provide response has been greatly appreciated. The French and New Zealand Christchurch Call teams has undertaken a first analysis of the answers submitted and drafted a preliminary report, which I will present just now, and which will be shared on the Christchurch Call's website after this panel is over. And a more comprehensive final report will be published in December 18, and the original contribution received will be released in an open format on the website at this time. Initial results from the consultation show that the majority of participants believe the Christchurch Call has enabled significant achievements, including, first, that the main response promoting a unique multi-stakeholder approach to fighting against the spread of terrorist and violent extremists is half of the respondents. 2, raising the awareness internationally around terrorist content online through the support of a wide range of governments, tech companies, and civil society organizations. 3, developing and implementing crisis response protocol to prevent the dissemination of terrorist content in the aftermath of an attack. This protocol have unfortunately already had to be activated in several instances, as I did mention. While there remain areas of improvement, and we have, The protocols and enhanced communication processes established between companies, law enforcement, and relevant government agencies have made a positive impact on the ability to limit the dissemination and virality of this content following an attack. And 4, assisting in reforming the Global Internet Forum for Counterterrorism, the GIFCT, as an independent multi-stakeholder organization. The consultation also provides an interesting insight as to how supporters believe they have progressed in implementing the commitments of the call. I will not go into the details of the results, which, as I say, we will see in the preliminary report. But the consultation shows that the vast majority of stakeholders have taken their commitment forward. In regards to the next steps, the French and New Zealand Christchurch Call teams wanted to better understand the expectation of the call supports as we set out to refine our strategic plan for next year. Our initial analysis shows that, according to respondents, the main areas of forthcoming focus for the Christchurch Call should be: first, promoting further collaboration between companies and national authorities, 25% of respondents. 2, increasing the numbers of companies supporting the call. 3, enhancing dialogue between stakeholders groups and fostering a greater culture of multi-stakeholderism. 4, facilitating agreement of a common definition on terrorist and violent extremist content. And 5, improving transparency measures in place both within government and tech companies. I can only speak for France, but I have no doubt that our New Zealand colleagues share this engagement. We remain fully committed to work collaboratively and in a truly multi-stakeholder approach to prevent the abuse of internet. As I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation, it remains much to be done. And I am particularly grateful to all those who participated in this consultation for helping us to understand what we have done well and where we have more work to do. More work to be more inclusive, more collaborative, to continue to build trust between the various stakeholders. More work to ensure that what happened in the aftermath of the Christchurch attacks and at a smaller scale in the aftermath of Halle in Germany, Conflans, Vienna, and others never happens again. The level of expectation from the call stakeholders, and in particular from civil society stakeholders, commits us to double down our efforts to further develop and refine the Christchurch Call going forward. But I am confident that our multi-stakeholder approach is the right way to fight against terrorist and violent extremist content spreading online. Thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to discuss these results further with the stakeholders present this morning and with you all.
Thank you so much, Henri. Really good to have that feedback from the participants in the call and to be able to think a bit more on the information they've provided and things we can do next. I guess one of the key questions coming out of that I'd like to ask the panel to comment on is their reflections on ProAid, given what we've heard from the community consultation. How do you as panelists see the work that has been done to date, where are the areas where you see the greatest, I guess, developments coming out of the call? Perhaps if I could start with you, Courtney Gregoire, as a starting off point with that question before going to Anjum.
Sure. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Henri. It is great to be able to talk about this a little bit further today. I am really proud to hear the feedback you've heard from the community consultation. And I think the comments I would give align with some of those remarks. If we reflect on the journey we have been on since the Christchurch Call to Action outlined the clear mission and desire to combat the distribution and exploitation of online environments by terrorists and violent extremists, I think there are 3 ways it has really improved our environment. First, as reflected, it really has raised awareness of the challenges involved in addressing real-world harms and the intersection with online environment. It has brought more stakeholders into that conversation. It's enabled us to learn together and grow together, dedicated to the same fundamental mission. Second, it took a really important step of identifying specific concrete actions. So for example, you see in the community update, tech companies that have signed on to the call having taken concrete steps to address the challenges posed by the live streaming environment, to improve how individuals can report concerns of content that they see on our platforms, and great improvements in our respective transparency reports to help the entire community understand the actions that are being taken. For example, Microsoft increased our transparency just last month in our new updated structure of that report. Lastly, and probably most importantly, is how the call has advanced multi-stakeholderism and really brought it to bear in a new and most important light. If we think about the challenge of combating real-world terrorist and violent extremism, we acknowledge that we really need a whole-of-society approach. We need to be thinking through the elements that lead to radicalization, move people towards action, and understand the intersectionality with the online environment. We can only do that with the multi-stakeholder approach that brings all of those perspectives to the table. I think what we know now, and particularly in light of what we are seeing around the globe, we need to lean in even more. We need to lean even more because we acknowledge that those who want to exploit the online environment, those who want to attack our democratic principles and harm innocents, are changing their tactics rapidly and evolving. That's why actions like how we've adapted to address the content incident protocol are so important, but there's even more work to do.
Thank you, Courtney. Really helpful. I'm sorry if I dropped out for a moment there. I had an internet disconnection and I'm back again. Anjum, could I turn to you? It'd be great to hear your reflection on civil society perspective and from one of the communities most affected by the events in Christchurch on call progress to date and the outputs of the consultation.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Koutou katoa, assalamu alaikum, and bonjour, everyone. I'd just like to quickly acknowledge the mana whenua, the First Peoples of New Zealand, and particularly the victims of the Christchurch terrorist attacks, which gave rise to the Christchurch Call, as well as victims of violent extremism around the globe. I think for the advisory network, some of the important achievements that we've had over this last year or more, 18 months, first of all, was in the group coming together and advocating for civil society participation in the call and the support given from the governments to create the network. There was significant input into the wording of the call and through Paris, Ghana, San Jose, along with 2 meetings in New Zealand of civil society members. And I think it highlighted, as did the workshop last year in Wellington, run by Google and YouTube, that really the response to violent extremism and terrorism has to be done with the participation of civil society, that you cannot have effective responses solely by technological or technical solutions, but actually you need social solutions and a wide range of expertise that includes lived experience. The ability to speak to these issues in New York at the UNGA side event, where Diakiali, Deborah Brown and myself were able to speak on the key issues and also then to meet with the tech companies. I think for us, this embedding of the idea of collective and collaborative action in this space has been hugely important, and what that has led to has been some collective advocacy by members of the advisory network, whether it was the recent public letter to France or the letter to the GIF-CT, also involvement of members with the GIF-CT.
Thank you, Anjum. Henri, some quick observations from you. Are there things there that really resonate for France and from the perspective that you've seen?
Yes, but I did express myself a bit. I think that one very important step forward is around transparency. I deeply understand that sharing data is complicated. We have to deal with privacy issues, and that's very important. And we have to deal with intellectual property and technological secrecy from companies. But if we want a real multi-stakeholderism, if we want collective intelligence, we need common knowledge. We need to organize ourselves, respecting privacy and intellectual property, to be able to ask new questions, to test hypotheses, to exchange around data and around facts. And I hope that it will be a constant era of improvement and that we will be able to work together about this issue.
Thank you, Henri. That very, very useful point on transparency. And just on transparency, can I just remind those who are listening in or joining us that if you have questions to ask, please feel free to do so at any stage through the question portal, and those will get picked up and we will cover them off in the question and answer session at the end. On from where the Christchurch Call has been, perhaps if I could ask participants, what do you see as the greatest areas that require a bit more emphasis, or where there are challenges to work through? What are the key areas of sort of headwinds or waves that we need to take this waka, this canoe through to get it to a point of being successful? And I might just ask Anjum if you could step us through your thoughts on that first.
Okay, so some of the things that I think we really need to start addressing, first of all, definitions and shared understandings around what is terrorism and violent extremism. We know that the UN list, for example, is missing right-wing extremists. And rather than looking at exact definitions, coming up with some basic principles, and also recognising the roles of government in this area through denial of basic rights, suppression of opposition, use of political rhetoric that scapegoats communities, participation in or funding of wars in other countries. All of those things have to be brought to the table in our understanding of this, of the problem statement. I think also we need to look at representation. For me, that's a big one, and ensure that countries from Asia, Africa, and the Middle East are much more involved, that the Christchurch Call advisory network is more global. Because we can't just have the US and Europe deciding all the rules of the internet for the whole world, but also the need to have a very strong human rights-based approach. There really is no other option if we want to solve these issues, and that includes Indigenous rights and giving voice to communities that are most affected by extremist content. We need to move into the area of regulation around transparency and accountability and start having some constructive, collective, and collaborative conversations in that space. And I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you, Anjum. Lots to think through there, and I think that point about diversification and global coverage is a really important one to be picking up on. Courtney, your thoughts from an industry perspective. Where do you see the places where we might place greater emphasis, or where we've got some challenges?
Thanks, Paul. I do want to underscore Anjum's really thoughtful comments. First and foremost, if we think about the global challenges in this environment, that needs a really intentional focus on diversifying the perspectives as part of the call and as part of how we address these issues. It needs to be an inclusive process. And I think my comments from the industry side actually reflect some of the challenges that we face in that space as well. I think the community report indicates a desire to expand the number of companies engaged in the work of the Christchurch Call, engaged in the work of addressing terrorist and violent extremist content online. And I think that's a really critical step that we need to focus on. If we look at what is occurring right now, we're seeing changes in tactics of the terrorists and violent extremists in terms of what platforms they utilize, whether that's to organize, radicalize, or distribute information. We're seeing rapid changes in that area. Just this past week in the United States, the New York Times reported about a significant shift to platforms such as Parler and Rumble and Newsmax. In fact, seeing that Parler's membership doubled in just a 1-week period of time, leveraged by some who were saying it was an intentional alternative use of a new social media platform. We at the Global Internet Forum for Counterterrorism have been investing in research to better understand this. And the Global Network on Extremism and Technology has issued some critical insight papers recently. And I think one element to think through that is brought out in some of that work is that acknowledgement that extremist groups have truly mastered the art of maneuvering through the online environment. We can't rest on our laurels, and we need to make sure that we take the steps to learn, understand, and thus think before they change their tactics.
Thank you. That's a critical point, I think, this piece around capability being built amongst extremist groups, and the need for us to be continually looking to build capability and try and get ahead of that. Doing that in a multi-stakeholder fashion delivers perhaps the best outcomes, but it will also pose some challenges in moving quickly in response. Henri, from the perspective of a government participant, how do you see us being able to make progress on those points that Anjum and Courtney have raised? You know, the areas where we really have some challenges to push through or need to emphasize more.
Yeah. First, I want to say that Anjum made a point. Of course, the conversation about what can we afford, what is exactly terrorist content, is, if it's a theoretical conversation, it's very complicated. But I think that here, within the Christchurch Call, we took the good approach, because we are trying to build a jurisprudence, and even it is very difficult, for example, to agree on a precise common definition of terrorist content. We can all agree about the fact that, for example, the head of the French teacher, the picture made by the terrorist is unacceptable. And because we are working in this kind of common law approach, discussing about a jurisprudence, I think that it's a good way to address this. And so from my perspective, the next issue is to enforce our multi-stakeholder approach, to have more point of view, to take the time to exchange about facts, about examples, and to design together a strategy. And that's, we don't have so much forum to have this kind of conversation, to be frank. And that's the unique and the virtue of the Christchurch Call.
Thank you. I think, Henri, that's a really good point. There's a common thread there through those discussions, really, coming from Anjum's point around definitions and the need to find a principled approach to that. That means that we can include and pick up on elements of content that we might not have found embedded in sort of traditional jurisprudence or legal or statutory in particular, to respond to some of the emerging threats of violent extremism. And I think a really useful piece there, Courtney pulled up, of making sure that we are prepared for the capability of extremist groups to adapt, to shift, to move platforms, and to really push into the edges of the technology that is available to them these days. That is something I think we've all seen in recent times as a challenge to work with. Perhaps flipping to the other side of the equation, and I perhaps start with you, Courtney. Looking ahead over the next sort of 6 to 12 months, what opportunities do you see particular progress on the work of the, I think you've highlighted already, engaging with companies. How do you see developments over the next 6 to 12 months affecting our ability to do that, positively or otherwise?
Thanks, Paul. I do think there's an inflection moment really highlighted because of the broader awareness globally, thanks to, honestly, the critical work of everyone on this panel and a broader set of communities, that we can open a new conversation with a broader set of stakeholders in the tech industry about this important work and what it means. I think if we look forward 6 months from now, there's also an element to ensure that our Global Internet Forum on Counterterrorism remade as an independent organization really helps not just tech companies, but really the entire civil society and community understand both the tools that smaller platforms can use to tackle this problem and make it honestly not so daunting for a new small startup company or a new app, that they understand what being part of the community can help them in terms of understanding, knowledge, tools, and really the collaborative effort. We've already talked about it, but I also think the next 6 to 12 months reflects our continued commitment to improve along the content incident protocol. I want to take a moment and reflect the tragedies that occurred most recently in France and Austria. We all are learning as we go through this. And to put this into context, when the founding members of the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism developed a content incident protocol following the Christchurch tragedy, we actually have communicated over 100 times. In fact, the incident in Vienna on November 2nd marked the 100th real-world event that technology companies helped share information and what we would call a situational awareness. That's important because as individual companies, we take action across our services based on our own terms of service and our own community guidelines. But we have an ability collectively to understand better situationally what's going on in the online environment, understand how migration across platforms might be occurring. Those communications are important, but we want to make sure that we can address these issues thoughtfully and, as everyone has reflected here, with a true commitment and thinking first and foremost to a commitment of human rights. The reason we do this work is to protect human rights. We want to make sure that our actions to address content similarly live up to that spirit.
Thank you, Courtney. Anjum, some observations from you on this point. And just thinking through some of the pieces on crisis response, it'll be good to hear perhaps how you see that work unfolding and the perspectives there from the perspective of a group that was tremendously badly affected by what happened in Christchurch.
Yeah, I think for me, in looking at the year ahead, first of all, it's about continuing to build trust and to build relationships. I think one of the unique aspects of the call, as opposed to any other organization, is that it has the potential to be a true power sharing space. And, making sure that we are looking at equity-based solutions. So, for example, that as much effort and resource is put into dealing with far-right and white supremacist extremism as other forms of extremism, that standards are applied fairly and evenly, regardless of the power held by individuals or groups, and how that is affected by a profit-making model. What impacts is that having on individual and community safety? I think also one of the benefits of the call, and something that I'd like to see harnessed a lot more, is learning to take that difference and work with it. That we know we can't agree on everything, we can agree on some things, but it's about creating that goodwill so that we are able to disagree and we're able to put our perspectives and try and come to some solutions, not all solutions maybe. I think there is much more scope to harness the expertise of the advisory network to advise both tech companies and governments going forward. And I think there needs to be much more building of capacity within the advisory networks and starting those tripartite conversations. There's always a challenge of changing personnel in organisations and governments and having to bring new people up to speed so that the conversation doesn't go backwards, but we still need to keep our focus on moving forward and not rehashing the same conversations.
Thank you, Anjum. I think there's some really useful takeaways there in terms of how we curate perhaps what you might call a Christchurch Call community and ensure that it provides opportunities for all to learn from each other. And being realistic, I think, about the fact there will be more we agree on than that we disagree on, and that we can make progress on. The disagree pieces, we can work with as well. Thank you. Henri, your thoughts on progress over the next 6 to 12 months? Where the opportunities lie?
Yeah. First, I want to underline that it's not just that we respect each other and we agree to disagree. It's more than this. Is that a good solution need controversies, need conversation, need to test some ideas and to exchange and to have a diversity of point of view. So, to be frank, I feel more than comfortable about the fact that sometimes we don't agree. That's very important. From my perspective, we have to make progress in the next months on 2 or maybe 3 things. But I did mention this. First, we have to extend the Christchurch Call community. And as Courtney said, we'll have to face the fact that now we have not anymore just mainstream social network. We have specialized social network with more violence, more conspiracy theory, and we will have to face this new context. The second point is transparency, and as I said, that's very important. France considers that we cannot just receive voluntary report or self-evaluation report. We need to work concretely together around raw data. But as I said, it's complicated and we need to build a framework of exchanging data while respecting privacy and intellectual property. And then, but I think that we'll speak a bit later about this. We did learn that we can improve the crisis protocol, and because sadly, the attackers change the strategy every time and we have to adapt ourselves every time.
Thank you, Henri. We're just starting to get some questions coming in, and I'll hold some of those for the moment, but I might feed some in as they come up in the topics we're talking about. But just a reminder, if people have questions, please feel free to feed those through. A specific question that it would be good to get people's views on, because it's already come up, is this question of how we strengthen participation, how we build multi-stakeholder engagement in the call. I think we've come to a splendid amount of agreement on the fact that it's actually fine to do things, but the key is to be engaged in a conversation with each other on common objectives. How do you see we best strengthen that multi-stakeholder engagement? What are the things that you would each most value in the community as we take that approach forward? Perhaps if I could start with you, Courtney, and we'll work our way around the screen.
Yeah, I think the spirit of both Henri and Anjum's comments earlier are what's critical and valuable to the multi-stakeholder engagement. We need the space and the trust and the community to have honest, frank conversations where we may not always agree. I would value, and I really appreciated the notion of how we could have even more engagement between the advisory network and the tech companies that have signed on to the Christchurch Call. I think there is a real important value in defining some work streams that we can collaborate and bring multi-stakeholder approaches. As folks may be aware, that is how we had envisioned the work of the Global Internet Forum on Counterterrorism working groups, identifying areas that need improvement, such as the crisis response protocol, ensuring that we have valuable expertise from governments, from civil society, from human rights community, from the academic community to inform the process. I think we need a similar approach if we think about algorithmic transparency, as was referenced by Prime Minister Ardern, and the important piece that Henri has raised several times. How do we get to a place that enables us to look at the data of what's occurring in a way that enables much more constructive conversation across the spectrum? Lastly, I want to upscore the importance as we talk about broadening the community. I acknowledge that what we really do need is additional perspectives from the Global South in particular to better understand emerging challenges where we may not have the, I'll call it, language or understanding to acknowledge how best to address online environments that are threatening those communities.
Thanks, Courtney. Anjum, your thoughts?
So I'm going to go back to my business management degree, which is my chartered accountancy, training. Is like we need to be really strong in terms of a clear focus of vision, mission, goals, which incorporate and have the commitment of all three participating groups on the call. Like we all have to be clear on those things. And for me, in terms of that process of engagement, like as an advisory network member, I want to know what the results of that engagement is. If I'm going to spend my time on a thing, I want to see that that time is making a difference, and how is it making a difference, and who is better off. So it's about finding that process where the three groupings that signed up to the call can engage in good faith and without defensiveness, and can, so that we can have that clear line of sight from engagement to results. What is it that we're hoping to achieve? How is it that we've helped to achieve those things? And then what do we do next?
Thank you, Anjum. Henri.
So how can we strengthen participation? Is it your question? Yes.
Yeah. What would help us most?
Yes, to be frank, it was difficult because for the last 9 months we have to also to face this pandemic, and for example, before the COVID-19 crisis, we had first meeting, for example, in Margin of the Internet Governance Forum, and that's very important when we can meet each other, work together in the same room. It's much more easy. So we'll try to find a solution, and before this solution, I think that each of us can take new engagements, that we can encourage each other to take new engagements, and that the report that I did present was the first move, and now we have an idea of what's important for the supporters of the call. So we are working honestly. We want to make progress. I'm sure that we will, but nothing is. So we did expect to meet during this Paris Peace Forum. It was an expectation, so it was not possible this time. I hope that we will be able to work together in the same room sooner or later.
Thank you, Henri. I think certain irony in the pandemic and that we can't meet in person, but we're all engaging from my room, in my case, the spare bedroom at my home, and Anjum, I think, in thing. I think it helps us all remember that right in the core of this, no matter what company, government, civil society, whatever faith we come from, we're humans trying to make a difference. I think what I'm hearing from this is that there's some work for us here in New Zealand and France. In fact, all of us on this panel tonight took more work into curating that community, and if there's anything that the pandemic might be teaching us, it's actually the need to lean in on the technology a bit more to make that happen. I might just turn to some of the questions now, if I could, because I think we've got about 10 minutes left. And there's some quite extraordinary ones, actually. So just I might do the first one as rapid fire. It's a great question, and from Jordan Carter at Internet NZ, and that was, what do each of the panelists see as the most difficult aspect of the call to make progress on? And why is that aspect so difficult? Can I get a reaction from each of you, please? I might start with work our way around counterclockwise.
Oh, counterclockwise was hard for me. Okay, that's right. That is actually a great question. I think one challenge, to be perfectly honest, is speaking about how we've talked about this. How do we get to a common taxonomy across the different challenges of violent extremism, and how that actually leans into the call talking about the need to address algorithmic transparency? algorithmic transparency means very different things across very different platforms. And we need to understand how that engagement model puts challenges in place to really honestly achieve the mission of the Christchurch Call. We have scoped some of that work, but I think the honest truth is, as we unpack that, we acknowledge the, I'll call it, disparity across different sectors of understanding how these algorithms work, and the need to acknowledge that every single product and service has an element to contribute to this that needs to have a conversation to tackle it.
Thank you, Courtney. I might just work my way through to Anjum and Henri then.
Yeah, I think from the point of view of the advice,
challenging.
Sorry, I think for the advisory network, one of the biggest issues, and John will know this, is resourcing. I think what we have in this space is we want many more civil society organisations to be part of the conversation, but we also know that, one, a lot of us are really stretched for resourcing, stretched for time and our ability to contribute. And so just trying to figure out how we can resource people to participate more fully in these discussions and to be able to, you know, really push in the areas that need some pushing to get positive change.
Thank you, Anjum. That's tremendous, and I think a good takeaway for us. Henri.
Yeah. First, let's mention that the biggest challenge was how to tackle terrorist and violent extremist content while respecting human rights, freedom of speech, open and free internet, rules of law, and we don't do so bad. So let's congratulate ourselves. We had to face an important challenge, and maybe it was a goal of the terrorists to push us not to be democratic, and we didn't make so bad. Then we have, as I did mention 3 times, we will have to face and to find solution to face another challenge, which is, can we exchange raw data to be more intelligent and more and to activate our teams and to work and to ask new questions, etc. So we will face this. And maybe, as Courtney did mention, I think that we will have to face a new challenge, which will be hate-dedicated networks, which won't be part, obviously, of the Christchurch Call, but will contribute to share this kind of content. And that's an enigma so far. How can we, as a Christchurch Call community, concretely face these new threats?
That's a great point, Henri, because it's actually one of the questions that's come in. Panelists see that we might deal with things like messages of hatred. How do we put those in the spotlight alongside what would be more classically called terrorist content and address that? And I'm going to seek rapid fire responses to that as we try and work through the sort of questions we've got here. Anjum.
So I think, and I've heard this from a lot of the advisory network, that the solutions can't be just technological, they can't just be online. Actually, often what's online is a reflection of what's happening in the real world, and we need to marry those two together, and it needs to be a very human solution. So again, it's about trying to get to those points of shared understanding of what's acceptable, what's not acceptable, while allowing people to be able to express what they need to be able to express in a civil society.
Kapai, thanks, Anjum. Courtney, thoughts on this? It's a perennial challenge for companies as they think through the legal frameworks they have to live with.
It's true, and I appreciate Anjum's critically important point, because we have to honestly take a moment and acknowledge that discourse on online platforms is a mirror of discourse that's happening in the real world. And so we need to work on the fundamentals as we think about what that means. And then as technology companies and platforms, we need to think about how we ensure the ability for individuals to talk and report any concerns that they may have. When it comes to addressing terrorist and violent extremist content, I think we understand and importantly have acknowledged how our platforms individually think about those definitions. When we talk about the challenges of disrespect, hate speech, we acknowledge that there are very different standards. And if we're going to live up to our commitment of how we acknowledge the desire to create safe online communities, safe online platforms, with a commitment to human rights and freedom of expression. That is an important, important conversation that needs to be an ongoing discussion. But the first starting point, and I think we acknowledge this through the Christchurch Call to Action, was ensuring that platforms and services are exceedingly transparent about how their platforms can be used, what is it, the community guidelines, and what are the expectations. And this gets to the challenge. How do we start thinking about platforms who may not have the same commitments of creating those safe online conversations?
Thank you. I'm just going to, we've got 4 minutes left in which I need to quick summary, but I also want to get the other questions that are here out on the table, even if we're not going to be able to answer them now, so that we can record them and take them away for that conversation that we've been talking about tonight. But one of them goes to the question of elaborating a bit on how the EU work is involved, and in particular how the recommendations of the Christchurch Call feed into EU legislative work. And I think we might just hold that question for a moment. Can we be more specific on how dissemination of terrorist content was stopped in Europe? What mechanisms were implemented? A question that I think has come up anyway in the discussion, which is how we address imbalance of power in this conversation, that tech companies have billions of dollars in resources, have legislative power, and a point that I'd probably contest actually that says civil society is relatively powerless. I think there's quite a lot civil society can do if we make the space for them. Largely unfunded, I'd say, is probably true. So the question there is, how do we ensure that the voice of civil society is heard? And finally, a question around, can you use media education to combat extremism online? And I think, again, that's something that the Christchurch Call asks for. The answer is, I think, yes. The question, how we make that more effective? I've got those questions out because I think it's important to acknowledge them and make sure to pick them up in the work that I think will come out of the conversation we've had tonight. Just as we look to sum up, I think key takeaway that I can find in this conversation is that we've created a spirit of space, a space where we have built some trust relationships, and we need to actually continue growing and actively curate them to look at some key issues. First, how do we grow company participation? How do we think more diversely about the global south and other participation in the community? How do we draw more deeply on each other's capabilities? I think Undrum has really left us with a call to action there that we, particularly sitting in Wellington and in Paris, could take away and think a bit more on. How do we see disagreement as a positive thing and all get more comfortable with it, acknowledging that we actually agree on the majority of stuff that we're trying to achieve? How do we work around the edges of that where it comes to things like definitions and taxonomies? How do we find a way to build that on principles so that we do capture new forms of violent extremism that we might not otherwise have considered or that we might not even have thought of yet? And in particular, how do we think about improving the crisis protocol and think about transparency and data sharing? Those to me seem critical points. I might stop there though and thank everyone for their contributions and just ask if the panelists want to finish tonight rather than me, just with a very short sentence summing up, the one big takeaway for you from here that we will then feed in. Courtney.
It really is a moment of thank you and appreciation to the spirit of the Christchurch Call and a new model for multi-stakeholderism. I often say it, we are talking about a very whole of society problem. The only way we can tackle it is a whole of society solution, and that bringing these communities together to have these conversations is critical.
Thank you. Anjum.
Yep, I'd like to say, let's be bold, let's be brave, let's, really push the boundaries. I think I'd love to see more participation in the call, particularly from civil society, to strengthen that voice and give us the power that that questioner was talking about.
Totoko, and I know the PM has said much the same thing. Henri, a closing note.
Yeah, thank you. Just a word, I think, and I share this spirit. We are not just fighting against terrorist and violent extremist content. We are fighting for democracy, and that's very important.
Thank you, Henri. On that note, I'd like to thank all the panelists tonight and everyone that's joined us. Merci à tous et à toutes. And we will return to this in the Christchurch Call community in the coming weeks. It's given lots of really good thought to take, material that I think will be amplified by the full results of the consultation. Thank you, everyone, and I hope day passes exceptionally well, or the weekend here in New Zealand as it now for us. Good night from us, and good morning to others.
Bye.